Oye and Yolota. So, we're approaching semifinals. In this case, this video is made at the time of the build-up for the semifinal round for Stellar Explorers 12. I've started removing just the years or the seasons from the video markings because I realized that I pretty much have the same ones each year. So in this case, this video hopefully will stand the test of time, at least for the foreseeable future, because it's a summary of a lot of what to expect to see for the semifinals round. Now, semifinals is specifically for the top, usually 1/3 of teams or 30%. They have kind of the cutoff that they choose. But remember, for all of you that are moving into this competition round, you are going up against the other teams that have also done historically well on the competition round. So the competition is going to be even tougher. Broad things that we're going to take a look at through the course of this prep video. We're going to talk about a round overview, in particular what to expect, and kind of how things are a bit different in semifinals than they were in the regular competition rounds. I'm also going to go through some recommended procedures, things that I recommend for my teams, which are usually very competitive, though take those with a grain of salt. If you've got something that's been working with your teams, try and build on that. That's an important part of this program, is finding out the techniques that work so that you can get good outcomes for you and your teams. Then we'll go through kind of I don't want to, I mean, this video could easily be like 10 hours if I went into details on a bunch of the things. So this video is kind of giving you an overview on all of this, and then you'll probably need to go through and brush up on individual skills, but I'll try and point out places where you can do that. In particular, we're going to go through and talk about some of the key things that I would recommend brushing up on from QR1, which is primarily going to be STK skills, and then also orbital related things. And for many of the teams participating in semifinals, it's probably been a while since you've actually done any of the orbital stuff, so please don't underestimate the importance of brushing up on that. Because usually QR1 happens in like October, and then semifinals is happening in late February. And you don't normally do much with STK, or especially changing orbits in QR2 or QR3. Okay, item 4, we'll look over QR2. We'll talk a little bit more about spreadsheets and what I refer to as budgets, but basically keeping track of adding materials, storing materials, and then removing materials. So that's common for data or power or sometimes heat management, that sort of thing. Then the last major one that we'll take a look at are some key skills that I think would be useful to brush up on and be familiar with for QR3. Now, QR3 is also going to rely heavily on the spreadsheet skills, so the spreadsheet skills that I lay out for QR2 can easily be scaled to apply for QR3, but a big thing to keep an eye out for in semifinals is being able to do interpolation relatively quickly and, most importantly, reliably. And then we'll have a little bit of conclusion summarizing the stuff that we've seen and recommendations. Okay, jumping in. I'm not going to read all of these slides throughout the video, but I did make them a little bit dense because I figure some people may not want to listen to me and instead possibly just pause and read the stuff off the slides. So they've got a lot of the information, but I'll probably supplement them with additional things. Okay, round overview. So the thing to understand about semifinals is you will need skills from all 3 rounds. You will be doing all the things that you do in all 3 rounds, at least overall. Normally, and I think Stellar Explorers also mentions this, that semifinals will pretty much almost always focus on 2. And what that means is, so QR1 can be very complicated if you have something where you've got a very complex orbit. Like your orbital parameters, your altitudes, for instance, are limited between 200 kilometers and maybe like 2,500 kilometers. Well, that's a lot of space that you could get a satellite super close to Earth. You might have it much farther out. And so that makes it where you can get a much more complicated orbit that you have to design. Or they could have something much simpler where it's your minimum orbit is 200 kilometers and your maximum orbit is 400 kilometers. Not to say that that's going to guarantee that that's an easier orbit, because that could still be complex. But depending on how they set it up, you could have something where, yeah, you'll have to select orbital parameters, but you may not necessarily have to spend a whole lot of time on it. It all depends on the details of how they set it up. Likewise, they could have a either complex or not complex QR2. A complex QR2 representation would be, okay, you have to choose 4 or 5 different things for the satellite. You have to choose a camera, you have to choose a hard drive, you have to choose a transmitter, you have to choose a battery, you have to choose a bunch of different things for the satellite. Well, that's what you saw in QR2, and that would be a complex QR2. But you could have a simple QR2 where they say, okay, you're going to focus on designing your orbit, and we're going to give you a bunch of information about launch vehicles. And so for the QR2 part, you might just have to choose a battery, or sometimes you may not have to choose a battery at all. Maybe you choose 1 or 2 components that go in on the satellite instead of having half a dozen or more. That would be a simpler QR2. And for QR3, for instance, you could have a complex one of those where you have 4 or 5 different launch vehicles, multiple launch sites, and have to deal with some complex analysis on adding CubeSats or other secondary satellites onto the launch vehicle to try and offset costs. Or you could have something that's a little bit more straightforward. You're choosing from 2 or 3 rockets, and you don't have a whole lot of complexity, not a lot of CubeSats that you're loading on. You might not even have CubeSats at all, depending on the nature of the mission that they put together. My point on this is don't fall into the trap of thinking that there are only 2 rounds in there. You will be applying key skills for all 3 rounds, but what they usually do is they'll make 2 of them decently complex, like the qualifier rounds, and then 1 of them, they'll cut it back quite a bit where you're only doing a very simple, straightforward type scenario for that particular round. The most important thing that I want to notify teams of, especially if this is your first time doing this, I've watched so many teams over the years get frustrated by what's different about semifinals than any of the qualifier rounds. So even if you've been knocking it out of the park in the qualifier rounds, I remember our first year doing this, we had a team that I think was in the top 20 score for QR1, QR2, QR3. They would show up and they would do the qualifier rounds in about 3 hours. They'd come up with a good solution on it. They'd say, hey, we're good. And then they would go home. We didn't force them to stay. We let them choose their own pacing on that. And I watched that team fall apart in semifinals. And the reason why is, 1, they weren't done after 3 hours, and they hadn't really gotten the practice of working on a problem like this for that long. So hopefully you've built up a tolerance for it that you can go the full 6 hours with your brain engaged so you can actually get that done. But the other thing, especially talking with them afterwards, they just got so frustrated because in QR1, you're told some limits on what you can do. You can't go above a certain orbital inclination, or you can't go above a certain orbital altitude. In QR2, you are almost always told, okay, here is your maximum weight. Here's what you are limited to in what you can actually do, and you can build out a solution based off of those fixed numbers. In QR3, you're told, okay, your satellite has this much weight. And so you can go through and see, okay, which of the launch vehicles is able to do that. If you haven't realized this, one of the most interesting things that makes semifinals and nationals entirely different, and also something that better represents real-life engineering problems, is everything is interrelated. So for instance, you may go in semifinals and you spend a few hours, your team working STK, the QR1 side of things. They say, okay, we're getting really good contact times for an orbit that is at an altitude of 500 kilometers and an orbital inclination of 70 degrees or something like that. And then they've given that information over to the satellite team, the QR2 people. And for QR2, they go through and say, okay, to make the best use of the time that we've got, we need to have this camera, we need to have a hard drive big enough to hold all of it, and we need a decent sized transmitter to actually get that down so we're not dropping data so that we can get a good score on it. And then with all of that, the QR2 team says, okay, our satellite is going to weigh 1,200 kilograms. And then the QR3 team says, well, that won't work. For an orbit of 500 kilometers altitude at an inclination of 70 or 75, whatever I said. But with the numbers that the QR1 people came up with, so the orbit people, and the weight that the QR2 needed, QR3 people, the people tasked with the launch vehicle stuff, may say, our maximum weight that we can get up to that orbit is only 1,000 kilograms. You're 200 kilograms overweight. We just can't do it. You can work for several hours and then find out that you just can't make your solution that you've put so much effort into, it can't be worked at all. Because the QR3, the launch vehicle people, may come back and say to QR2, the satellite people, hey, you got to lose some weight. We got to drop 200 kilograms in order for us to get it up to this orbit. And then the QR2 people may try and do that. They say, okay, let's cut back on the hard drive. Let's go to a mid-range hard drive instead. That could drop us down under the weight. And then when they run the numbers, they find we're dropping all of our data. We went from getting like 50 points down to getting 2 points. This just isn't a good solution anymore. We can't work with this low of weight. And so instead, they may go back over to the orbit people and say, hey, we can't get this weight up to that altitude. You're going to have to drop the altitude down. And then the orbit people have to generate the new reports. All the numbers change. And then when they pass it off to the satellite people may say, well, now with these contact times, our selections don't make any sense anymore. And we're still getting very few points. I'm going a bit on a tangent on this because I want you to kind of really engage with the thought of that. Because I got to tell you, I've watched so many capable students that have been knocking it out of the park with QR1, QR2, and QR3, and they just get so frustrated, and I've watched teams fall apart under that frustration. So one of the things that you need to know going in is if you're feeling like that, don't let it get you, right? Keep focused on okay, at the very least, we know something that won't work. Let's go back to the drawing board and let's try a different approach. Maybe something along the lines of, hey, QR1 team, our orbit team, drop the orbit down some because we think we're going to need all this weight. So see if you can get us an interesting orbit to work with that maxes out at maybe 400 kilometers instead. And we think that we can make that work, and we could still use the satellite and the rocket that we've got going. You may find yourself back at square one, and that's something that you really need to be prepared for. A lot of this is honestly very much representing real life engineering. There are only a handful of numbers that are kind of locked in. Like, for example, the budget. Many of you are probably coming off of QR3, where the budget is kind of a hard line that says you can't go over budget. Or if you did go over budget, you get 0 points. That's another thing about semifinals. Semifinals itself, the score is going to become significantly more complicated. You're probably going to have part of the score that's coming from trying to achieve your mission. So if you're trying to, I don't know, scan the Amazon rainforest or whatever, you'll get a number of points based on how many minutes you secure of scanning the Amazon rainforest and get that data successfully secured at a different ground site. That's QR1 and QR2 skills right there. And that may be something like half of your score, if not more. It may be the majority of your score. But you'll also have scores that are coming from your budget. So your budget may be, I don't know, $50 million. But this time, which is something that you may not have seen in your QR3, you could go over budget, but you'll have a penalty. So for every $100,000 over budget, you might lose a point or something like that. So you can actually go over budget and still have a good solution. One of my teams several years ago did very, very well by submitting a solution that was over budget. They went about 2% over budget, so slightly over budget, but they did just a really good job of collecting that data from the rainforest and getting it down to the ground level. So there aren't really hard numbers in most places that you just can't work around. The few exceptions on that are definitely going to be things like your launch vehicle's lift capabilities. So if there's one thing that I can caution you all on, and you'll see it in our later part of this video, but be very careful not to go overweight. Do not go overweight. That's super, super bad in space mission design. Other things that you should be aware of. The packets have a tendency of being much larger. They may be 30 to 50 pages. A lot of that is just for the level of complexity, but a lot of that may also, don't get too intimidated by it, because a lot of that may actually be tables. So if you're selecting components for hard drives and transmitters, those are going to take a quarter to a half a page for them to actually just put in that information. So it's not a whole bunch of reading, but it is important stuff that you need. If you're able to choose from several different launch vehicles. Usually the launch vehicles, their performance tables, especially for the wide open field of semifinals and nationals, you'll probably take up an entire page giving you the performance capability of the launch vehicles, because you can make a bunch of different orbits. So they need to give you all of that information. But be aware that you're going to have a large packet. If you're a team that actually makes physical copies of them, remember to destroy them by the appropriate time, But keep that in mind that that will take even longer to print and copy them. What I would recommend is see if you can do some educated guessing. So many of you are probably coming off of QR3. Maybe you looked at it and you saw that looking back, there was a rocket that was just shamefully expensive. Maybe as a way of saving some time, you could go through and do an educated guess that says, we're not going to bother with a shamefully expensive rocket that's super powerful that might be able to deploy a lot of secondaries, because that's going to require a lot of time and effort for us to balance that. Maybe instead we want to go with a medium power rocket that is decently expensive but not super expensive, and we're not going to try and focus on the CubeSats. I had a team that made nationals within the last year or two that when they did semifinals, they said, yeah, we were having trouble trying to come up with the orbit stuff, so we just went in really big and put a lot of our focus on trying to optimize the launch capabilities, and that worked out for them. Several of those teams that said that ended up making nationals. So sometimes making an educated guess and trying to focus on where you think is the best place to put your skills is something that might be a good move for you to do. Or it might not. Maybe you make a bad educated guess on that, and then it ends up costing. I don't know. There isn't one magic thing that I can tell you that's going to ensure success, but there's a lot of skills that you can build along the way. Okay. Remember, stay focused and stay motivated when you're doing semifinals. It is easy to get overwhelmed, but stay on task and you all can do great work. Another thing to keep track of, every point is going to count. So as of the recording of this video for the last couple of years, making nationals has been based entirely on the scores in the semifinal round. And so every single point counts. I know 2 or 3 years ago, we had a team that went to nationals, and let's see, I think in semifinals that year, there was one team that got like 50 points on the semifinals scenario. That was the first place for semifinals. The second place team had something like 20 points for the scenario. And then the other 8 teams that made nationals had 15 points and some change. And so it came down to 1/10 of a point. Similar things have actually happened at nationals before as well. And I do want to point out, one of our teams actually was within 1 point. They were in that range. I think they had something like 15.2 points. I think they were 8th overall in that semifinals. They went on to nationals and ended up winning nationals. So that's something where every single point can count. That's also, that makes the academic quiz incredibly key. The academic quiz is one of the few things that you and your team can straight up control. So you should do prep for that. If you're a team that's just showing up and it's like, we'll open up Nova Space for the first time after we've clicked the go button on the competition round, don't be surprised if you're not going to make nationals. I do recommend, we do have, in fact, I'll go over there now. Let's go to the website. Let's see. So here is Stellar Explorer's main page. And then under the training materials, we've got some sample scenarios that they have available. If you keep scrolling down, we have the study guides here. One thing that I want to point out on the study guides is here's QR1. Here's QR2. They go slightly over 1 page. Here's QR3, which is just 1 page. And then semifinals round, which goes almost 2 complete pages. If you look closely, it looks like semifinals is actually QR1 and QR2 combined. You might double check on that. So if you've done some prep resources, maybe those might still be useful. But you're covering a lot more material, which means you're going to have to look through Nova Space, or you're going to need to know a lot more. The more you can come in prepared, they give you a list of all the things that they might ask about, and the Nova Space learning modules have a lot of questions that you can practice on. And if you come prepared, you can get through the academic round much faster. I would say, from what I've seen before, the teams that make nationals are the teams that are consistently getting like 19 out of 20 or 20 out of 20 on the academic quiz. And the other thing is you'll have a 6-hour competition window, just like you did with the qualifier rounds, but it's a much more complicated scenario. And you're going to need all the resources and time that you can get. Come prepared for the academic quiz. So definitely do that. One of the other things that I want to mention is from my experience over the years, looking at the scores from the semifinals round. And please remember, the only teams competing in semifinals are kind of the teams that have been doing well in the regular season. So they're the teams that have kind of figured this thing out. And I would say between 1/3 and sometimes over half of teams go so far out of spec in semifinals, they have a solution that is so bad they get 0 points for the scenario. Do your best to avoid being one of those teams. Although, if past is prologue, that's going to happen a decent amount. It's easy to make a mistake and suffer some penalties. You want to try and reduce that as best you can. Some teams, because I am saying every point will count, and it absolutely does, they'll try and push the envelope and get the absolute best score they can. They'll add a few more CubeSats in because that's going to lower their budget overall, and therefore they'll get a few points. But if those CubeSats are going on at the expense of going overweight, you end up losing more points than you get back. So be mindful of that. And one of the things that I want to emphasize, any students that have worked with me before, they've heard me say this. This is the mantra that has worked the best for my teams, and I recommend for all teams. A good solution on time in spec is better than the best solution too late. I would recommend that your goal is not to go in and try and find the absolute best in every single thing that you can, because with all 3 rounds combined and that circular building that you have to do, I think that's going to be way too much for you to try and do. Aim for a good solution that you are pretty confident will actually stay in spec, and I'll bet 9 times out of 10 you're going to be at the top of semifinals and hopefully one of the top 10 to go to nationals. Okay. Time management is absolutely key when it comes to semifinals because it is all 3 of the previous rounds combined and a bigger, well, not a bigger academic quiz. It is still 20 questions, but it comes from a larger selection of them. And so it is easy to lose track of time. Which brings me to procedures and tips. Time management is absolutely key. I recommend all teams come up with a rough schedule beforehand so that you all have an idea and you don't end up panicked at the end. I think a lot of teams end up with trouble because they get to looking at the clock and, oh no, we got 10 minutes left. Okay, we just got to submit something. And then they go in and throw something in and then mess things up as they're putting it in. Time management is key. What I recommend for all of my teams, though not all of them do this, many have come up with kind of their own method. What I would fully recommend for teams, allot the first 20, ideally, to 30 minutes for your entire team to work together on the academic quiz. We'll talk about a couple of reasons why I think that's best, but especially if you have a team that has done some studying beforehand, people may come in with the knowledge and go, oh, I remember studying question number 1. The answer to that is fully ideal flow or something like that, or Molniya orbit or something. The more people that you have involved, especially if they've done the studying, the easier it is to go, okay, we don't even need to look that one up. We're confident that the answer is B or whatever it is. So by having the entire thinking capability of your team and their preparation together, you can hopefully go through the academic quiz faster. One thing that a number of my students have done, you've got 2 computers for the competition. Maybe have one of them where the team is actually actively answering questions, and then have the other computer logged in and working on NovaSpace. And go through, and maybe you can do, hey, we know the answer with a little bit of discussion to questions 1, 2, and 3. We're a little iffy on the question to 4, so we're going to ask the team with the other computer, go through NovaSpace and find our correct answer to question 4, while the rest of the team is going to go through and use our knowledge to answer questions 5, 6, and 7, right? This allows you to be dynamic and make good use of your limited 2 computers. And that's the other thing to bring up. You may think, okay, we only want 1 or 2 people working the academic quiz. I'll talk more about why I don't think that that's a great idea from another viewpoint a little ways into the prep. But you still are limited to only 2 computers. So if you're thinking that the 2 or 3 members of your team, or like 2 members of your team, are tasked with the academic, and then the other members of the team are going to start opening up STK and building their spreadsheet, well, you have only got 2 computers that you can operate at any given time. You can't use cell phones. You can't use any other powered smart device or anything like that. So remember, prep is going to be key. I think I've got this listed elsewhere, especially when we start talking about the round skills. I have plenty of videos on my website, and I'm trying to add more all the time, that can show you how to do something. But if you're taking 20 minutes to go watch that video, and remember, watching that video requires one of your computers. It is against the rules for you to get out like a cell phone or watch it on a different device. You have 2 computers that are available to the team during the competition. So if you're using If your plan is to brush up on my YouTube videos when you see what you need, that comes at the expense of one of your computers. So make certain that you're balancing that, and that's why doing the prep beforehand is important. I also think that with the academic quiz, having one computer where it's just on the quiz and the other computer where it's able to navigate Nova space so you don't have to go back and forth keeps it more direct. Having all hands on deck also helps you go through the academic quiz based on your pre-done knowledge by studying beforehand. Though I would recommend, even if you get bogged down some and the questions are more challenging than others, maybe after about 30 minutes, here's where the schedule comes in. After about 30 minutes, the team says, okay, we're going to split off and have a couple people finish up on the academic quiz. And the rest of us, now 30 minutes into our competition window, are going to start reading over the scenario. Again, one thing that helps out if you're a team that is in a position where you can make physical copies of the scenario packet, everyone doing the academic quiz all together at the beginning buys some time to actually get the printouts so that people can get highlighters and do all of that. Let's see. Then what I would recommend is after the 20 to 30 minutes of the academic quiz, maybe one or two people are still finishing up the academic quiz, but as long as the majority of the team has been thumbs up, which we'll talk about more later, on 18 of the questions from the academic quiz, then you've put all of your skill to good use. After you're done with the academic quiz, I'd recommend spending about 20 to 30 minutes to read the scenario packet. Now, that's going to take some time because there's a lot in there that you have to read. I know many of you want to jump straight to the scoring. Please don't do that. In fact, they've also mentioned multiple times that you absolutely should read the entire scenario packet, and you absolutely should. I'm going to mention on this that I heavily recommend the things that I've mentioned before. I'm going to talk about them a little bit further down where I refer to them as whiteboards or copy paper or something. But the objective, the constraints, and the scoring, anytime you're reading through the packet and on page 7, you come across something that looks like it's an important limitation, like if you choose, for instance, a certain type of camera or LiDAR system, it can't be subjected to more than 5Gs on launch or something like that. It's not in the normal place, but it's a key number that might result in your satellite being destroyed or not being able to do its job. Jot that down as you're reading it the first time. Circle it, highlight it, and most importantly, walk over to what I would describe as the constraints whiteboard and add that item. Weight limit or G limit, page 7. You don't need a whole lot on that, but make certain that you're not overlooking that. I've had several teams that had absolutely great solutions to the scenario, but then overlooked one small thing and it kept them from actually getting a good score. A good example on that recently is, I believe in QR2, students may have overlooked adding enough fuel to engage in some maneuvers, and a lot of teams ended up with straight up a 0 score from overlooking just one thing that was basically on one page. Detail is very important. Read through those scenario packets and come up with ways that you can kind of isolate and collect the key information as quick as you can so that the entire team is able to use it. Let's see. What I usually recommend is split into appropriate sub-teams. There's a good bet that you're going to have to work with a VDF on STK, so one of the computers is going to be using STK. As a reminder, at least of the recording of this video, it is against the rules to have STK open on more than one computer at a time. So you can only have it open on one computer, which is fine, honestly, because STK, one group is working on that on one computer, and the other group is working on the spreadsheet in Sheets. That's the beauty of semifinals. You don't actually have a strong incentive to have STK open on multiple computers because it's not just the orbit that you're dealing with. There's plenty of work to go around. But as a reminder, only one computer can have STK open at a time. This is one place where it can be advantageous to have more students on a team because you could have one or two people working at each of the computers, and anyone on the side can pick up hand calculators. But remember, you're limited to the basic functions of the calculators, so you can't do advanced stuff with it, but the basic functions of the calculators, and have them double check numbers. Or if you've identified that, hey, there's only 2 rockets or launch vehicles that you're choosing from, that it's a QR1 and QR2 heavily focused semifinals, then task the people that don't have a computer with the task that is the least complex, because that's the one that's going to be well suited to solving it by hand. It'll be a bit slower for them to solve it by hand, but you're still getting progress done. What I would recommend for time management, and this is something that I say to all teams, I fully recommend that about 5 hours, maybe 5.5 hours in, you have something that is a workable solution. So that way you can fall back on it. You do not want to be panicked when you're putting in all the information. Remember, you're probably going to have to save a VDF, more on that in just a little bit, and submit that. And you're also possibly going to have to fill out several pages worth of things that you're adding to the satellite and that you're adding to the launch vehicle. This is easy for teams to, if, oh, we've got to have this submitted in 5 minutes, it's easy to freak out, to panic, and put the wrong number in the wrong spot on that form. And you have a perfectly good solution, but you completely messed it up because you were too panicked and in too much of a hurry. I tell all of my teams that they should be aiming for 30 minutes out from the period that you've got to submit, be moving towards have a solution that you can put in. You want to be prepared. 10 minutes until the end of your window is when you, at the absolute latest, should be putting in your selections so that you're not panicked. Okay, useful tools, resources, and techniques. One of the things that has helped us out, although it has not proven 100% effective, I had a team not too long ago that would have made nationals, but they ran into an issue with putting their team name in correctly. Now, that's been diminished quite a bit for a lot of teams, but anyone can make a mistake. They didn't run into that problem in any of the regular qualifier rounds, and it's probable that in semifinals with that added stress, it's easy to mess up one small thing. One thing that helped out is my team director actually set up, and we hand a little strip of paper to the teams whenever they're actually competing, and all it has is their official team name, so STLX, as of the filming of this video, 12-0999 or whatever, but it has their full name correctly laid out so that they have a resource that they can always go back to. And I think it also has their login credentials for Nova Space, but those are kind of the key things that they need. And so that's been something that has been very helpful for our teams to cut down on things like team name mistakes. Once again, come prepared for the academic quiz. Know how to navigate Nova Space. As I said before, any videos that you're watching are going to occupy one of your computers, so it's best to prepare beforehand. But be aware of what those videos are and where to find them, because if you run into something highly technical, it helps to be able to go, okay, I can spend 5 or 10 minutes, I can go watch that video. That's going to set us back a little bit, but at least we'll have that information. It's hard to prepare for everything, after all. I recommend whiteboards, but even just copy paper can be a good thing to use, or making several sheets of copy paper and making a small quote-unquote whiteboard. But what I like about the whiteboards are you can actually prop them up where people can see them throughout the competition period and do things like objective, constraints, and scoring. I've talked about those in some of my videos. Objective is where you're putting all the key things that you want to get done, and I usually recommend having a diagram. Things that show if you're scanning the Amazon rainforest, have a picture of the Amazon, for instance, and then a line that goes up to your satellite. In particular, the camera, the thing that you're having to choose. And then the camera connects with a little line over to your hard drive. And then your hard drive connects to the transmitter. And the transmitter goes down to a little icon of a ground station in Europe or wherever you're returning the data to. Being able to visualize that helps you understand which access reports to pull up and which components interact with others. I heavily recommend having a good diagram showing what you're trying to achieve. That's your objective board. Constraints is where you put anything that you're not allowed to do, or key numbers that you need to make certain that you're within the limitations of. And then finally, scoring gives you an idea of, okay, where are our points actually coming from? Those are the 3 things that I think are very important to have as kind of a big thing that people can check regularly or see easily. I would also recommend hot seat and swap people out for breaks. The clock keeps ticking, so you're stuck with a 6-hour period. But I can tell you, as someone who's done a bunch of engineering type, like doing the things that you all are solving, the strain on your mental capabilities is overlooked by a lot of people. Until you've been through something like this, you can't really understand exactly how stressful it can really be. It's important to set up and have a plan for, okay, let's get someone, they've been sitting at the STK computer for an hour. Let's swap them out with someone else who can take over and kind of continue the work and have that person get some fresh air. Like, the Stellar Explorers doesn't really like students leaving the competition area. In nationals, you'll have very limited capability of doing that. You're not allowed to do things like checking on your cell phone or something like that. But one thing that can be very useful is taking a step outside, getting some fresh air, maybe a little bit of sunshine, walk for a couple of minutes, and then come back to not completely clear your head, but kind of reset. And I do really recommend that. Make certain that you're not doing anything inappropriate. If you're leaving the direct competition area, we've got an area that is actually right by our competition area where students can kind of walk out the door, kind of walk around in the sunlight for just a little bit, and there are big windows, so we're able to keep an eye on them. So make certain that you are being fair in your applications and not violating any rules. But I do recommend setting up being able to get some breaks. You'll probably want a meal break in there somewhere too. So take advantage of those times to clear your head and reset, because you'll get better outcomes if you do that. But you don't want to spend a quarter of your time taking breaks, because you need every minute you can get. One thing that works very well, if your team is not already doing this, as soon as they hit start, write down maybe on the board or somewhere where everyone can see, the start time was 10 a.m. and therefore we have to be absolutely done and submitted by 4 p.m. Have an idea clearly where people can see, okay, we're coming up on the deadline, it's an hour away. Make certain that you've got an eye on the clock as best you can. One of the last things that I want to recommend, at least for useful tools and techniques, is the VDFs. Now, recently in one of the more recent seasons, I can't remember if it's this one or not, some of the things that you are asked to do include area coverage. So that's something that comes up from time to time. It's not always there. So depending on the year, you may not be familiar with area coverage at all. In fact, let me jump out of this. Let's go back over to the ISAT website. And then we've got general knowledge. Let's see. Basic STK functions, and then we've also got, I think we've got more advanced STK functions, but let's see. Adjusting orbits. Here's where you can go to actually get last minute or help during the competition, because this is freely available. You don't have to log in for it. Even I'm having trouble. Maybe I should have come better prepared. That's basic functions in STK. Oh, I've got it marked as pro functions in STK. That's actually a holdover from a long time ago when there was an STK free and then a professional edition. I'm not going to go into details on that, but lighting times are going to be important. Area coverage. Here's a video that shows you how you can go about at least one of the ways of getting the area coverage. So that's something that I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you absolutely know all the steps on it, but be aware of where to find that. On that, one of the things that we've found, and we think it still keeps happening, though it may be something specific with our computer, sometimes STK gets a little confused. It's running a lot of numbers, and we've noticed on the area coverage that sometimes when we check something, it'll say like 97%. And then we check it again later with an entirely different orbit, and it still says 97%. In fact, there have been times where I've broken the orbit where it should tell me that there's 0% coverage, and it would still say 97%. There are times where STK might start wigging out a little bit. It's a very complex piece of software, and if you're running it through a lot of stress for hours on end, you might end up with an issue. One of the things that we've recommended for our teams is maybe every 30 minutes or maybe every hour to close out STK and reload the scenario from the beginning file, which brings me to one of the last things that I want to mention that teams may or may not be doing. When you get your initial VDF of the scenario, open it up and then do a save as. In fact, let me show you that right now. I opened up an older version of a scenario that I have, but let's say that this is the thing that I actually sent out. I think this is the fresh air scenario, but this is an earlier version of it, so it's not going to look like what you get online. But it was something that was easy for me to open up. Let's say that this is what you had received from Stellar Explorers. This is your scenario. The moment you open it up, do File, Save As, and make it a new saved as. One thing that I have recommended in other videos as well, go to the desktop and actually create a new folder. Let's see, can I make a new folder here? I think I can. Folder. There we go. And I will do semifinal round 2026 or STLX 12 or something like that. That also has it where if you keep all of your files there, that can be exceedingly useful. Let's say that this is the default one. So I can save it there and then I can load from it and then I can add something. I might do a dash and I might do something like, let's see, it is currently 12:39 hours. So maybe just put in the time or maybe a note, beginning analysis, something like that. It's whatever you want to do, but if you do that as doing the save as, now you can go through, make your changes, and then later what you do is you close out the STK window, like that. I might regret doing this. And then go back over to your folder, which should be on the desktop, Semifinals 2026. I like to move it into the middle so that it's easy to find. And then you can load this back up. It'll take a minute to actually load through, and some of my students that have gone to nationals before have said that sometimes the computers that they have may not be as powerful as the computers that you're used to working with, so you might adjust this depending on the power of computer that you've got. But closing out STK and reloading from the original file will clear any issues. Another common thing that happens, Stellar has warned us about it, that if you use the Orbit Wizard, I can't even remember where it is because I don't actually use it that often, but there's a spot where you can do the Orbit Wizard. Sometimes that will actually change your propagator. So if I go into my satellite, the propagator in this is J2 perturbation. Most of the time, that's the propagator. Just don't change it. Sometimes we've had other ones, like the HPOP, I think, if you're including materials that might deal with drag coming from the atmosphere. In short, there are things that you don't want to change, but they can get changed even if you don't catch it. One of the things I've warned students about is the mouse wheel if you're using a mouse, because even if you don't click on a thing, if you go past it with the cursor and use the mouse wheel, please note, now I'm adjusting the mouse wheel, but I never actually clicked on it. It's still changing those things. So be careful on that. And it would suck if you got to the end of 5 hours of working on something, and then you found out that 20 minutes in, you accidentally clicked the wrong button. Looks like it crashed. I'm going to open that back up, but that's fine. So periodically closing your scenario and then loading it from a clean copy, the original clean copy, is a great way of going about this. Let's see. I'm going to try opening that again. Maybe it wigged out. Okay, that's an interesting thing to happen. I'll load one as needed. Okay, jumping back into this. One of the other things that I'd like to recommend on this, and this is more of a team dynamic and people aspect. Team ownership. All key items like filling in forms. At the very beginning, when you all are filling out the form to get started, you might put in the team number wrong. So again, having that little strip and have everyone or at least multiple people watching it. And one of the things that we push our students to do is on any key thing, any submission, anything like that, everyone has to give a visible thumbs up and has to say, you know, we're good to go or we're go. So that way, if something goes wrong, if you're out of spec and you end up with a 0 score, you can't end up with it was your job to do the academic quiz. It was your job to do the putting in the team name. You messed it up. This helps foster team ownership and team dynamics. So nobody is stressed out thinking, oh no, what if I'm to blame? And then I end up with all of it. By fostering team ownership, it can help alleviate a lot of that stress and honestly help set you up to be a much more capable professional. And this is something that applies in so many different applications, even if you're not planning to go into engineering. But team ownership, starting up, we push students to everyone do the thumbs up. And even when they're putting in their selections at the end of the round, finishing everything up, that's definitely a big, we're going to put these in. Everyone's watching so that we're not messing anything up. And this is why it's important to have 20 minutes, 30 minutes left so that you don't feel rushed on it. And everyone can double check, did we put the right thing in at the right spot? And before you click submit, everyone does the thumbs up so that whatever comes about, everyone shares ownership, either if it's a success or even if it's a failure. So those are some of the things that I would recommend, especially on the VDFs. The VDFs are another part of that where it's here are the procedures that you can do to kind of get the best outcomes. Okay. QR1 skills. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details on these, but I have put together basically 5-ish skills related to each QR that I would recommend teams be prepared for, and I bet will likely pay off, but there's no guarantees. First thing, orbital elements. The more you can go through and design your orbit, the better. So for instance, if you know that you're targeting something like the North Pole, I think I'm writing a scenario where we're checking in on Santa or something like that. If you are one of the teams that has made semifinals by going through and just slowly adjusting your orbital parameters and going, okay, what if I change my argument of perigee? But instead, if you know, oh, if I want to look at Santa, I got to go further north. I need to go to an orbital inclination of 90 degrees. Knowing what each of these elements can do can help you save time that you don't have to go, okay, let's adjust this number. Wait, which one would move it east or west? The one that moves it east and west is going to be your RAN. So if I do not 180, let's do 75. If I do this, click apply, we can see that my orbit has now twisted around the poles and has moved eastward, it appears. So again, knowing how these orbital elements, what they do and how they manifest in an actual orbit can save you time, because you might go, okay, we've got a useless part of the orbit. So for instance, I want to scan a target in the northern hemisphere here in Edmond, Oklahoma. So maybe I want to have an elliptical orbit so I can spend more time on that. Maybe drop the perigee down to 200, orbital inclination of 90 degrees, and then my argument of perigee, I'm also going to need to adjust that as well. Let's make that, I think 90. Let's double check. Click apply. Oh, nope, I've got it wrong. 90 on my argument to perigee puts the perigee above the North Pole, which is not what I want. So instead, I would go to 270, apply, and I end up with my perigee above the South Pole. Again, this is something that can save an inordinate amount of time, and I would heavily recommend. But it's also one of the things that you have to kind of learn about. Once again, over at the ISAT website, if you go to General Knowledge, there's a page on orbital elements, the orbital parameters, and how you can actually work with those, particularly in STK. So that's stuff that you might brush up on. And those are pretty short videos too, so hopefully that will be helpful. Okay, let's see. You can go back and take a look at some of the ISAT QR1 scenarios while we're talking about that. The other thing that might be useful is if you go through and try and apply these ideas of Kepler's laws and orbital elements to try and, instead of just approaching a problem and throwing numbers at it and seeing if you get a good score, come in and read over the scenario and actually think, okay, my target's in the northern hemisphere. I bet I want an elliptical orbit. Like, go through and actually try and design an orbit. Getting practice on that can pay off, because that can save you a lot of time during semifinals and nationals. Some of the initial scenarios that I've got, which aren't very challenging, are ones that you could go through and really brush up on that, especially if you haven't seen those recently. Okay, let's see. I'm making reference to useless sides of orbits. If the only thing that you're looking for, if all of the targets that you care about are in the northern hemisphere, then the southern hemisphere part of your orbit, you don't actually care about. Maybe drop your perigee lower to spend less time there, which brings us to item 2, Kepler's second law. Now, all of Kepler's laws can be useful, but Kepler's second law is going to be a big one. Summarizing, satellites speed up when they're close to the Earth, and they slow down when they're farther out. Another thing that you might brush up on, and I think is part of the academic quiz, though might not be on this one, is Molniya orbits, which rely heavily on Kepler's second law. One of the other things to make note of is the access reports and pulling the correct ones. I made reference to this earlier. So, for instance, I have both the satellite that I could bring up the access report for Edmond, Oklahoma. Click Compute, Access Report. And I end up with, how many minutes does my satellite see Edmond? Why, that is 2,000 minutes. That's a lot of time. I'm making a whole bunch of points off of this. That's great. Although, what we actually want is the sensor scanning Edmond, Oklahoma. So I'm going to bring that up. And when I check the correct access report, I've only got 70 minutes, not 2,000 minutes. If you're pulling the wrong numbers, you pretty much can't reliably get a good solution. So, being able to navigate access reports and keeping track of what things need to talk to what things is very, very important. That also can be easier if you have an objective board with a diagram that shows you, oh, the satellite sensor has to look at Edmond. Okay. Oh, determining orbital period. I am going to show these because they're relatively quick. As a reminder on this, you can go into the properties for the satellite, which is right here. And then, instead of apogee and perigee altitude, switch over to period. The period is the time it takes for one complete orbit. By default, this is coming up in seconds, but I could change that to hours, or I could change that to minutes. But this is a very useful one, not only for orbit design, because you could look into resonances, But this is also very important for the QR2 stuff that we'll talk about here soon enough. And so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that, but there's stuff on my website for both of those, both orbital resonances and for battery cycles. Okay. Determining orbital period. Lighting time reports. Oh, yeah. Going back in. I'll stop going back and forth. I apologize. But I did want to show these while we're here in case you don't have time to check some of the others. So right click, go to the satellite, and then we can go to Reports and Graph Manager. Now it'll take a moment. Installed styles, I can expand this, and we're looking for the lighting times, either report or the graph. So we've got, that's lifetime, lighting time. This one that looks like a little notebook is the report, and then this one that has a little graph is the actual graph. So I'm going to do lighting time reports. Now remember, this one gives you sunlight times at the top and gives you the durations on those. As you keep scrolling down, there's a break, and then it gives you the penumbra times, and then eventually it will give you the umbra times. But I'm going to direct you to some of the other videos and other materials that we've got to brush up on what those mean. But here's where you can find the lighting report, which will be very important for possibly several things, but at the very least, making certain that you have enough power for your satellite if that's something they ask you to do. One of the last things, and I'm going to bring this up, many of you may not be familiar with it at all, but something that can show up in semifinals and at nationals is the equivalent circular orbit. This is something that you don't really see in the individual rounds themselves. I got this set up. There is a video lesson that goes in depth on it, so I'm only going to talk briefly about it, but I'm going to direct you to the QR1 C series scanners, and then if you go to the sheets lesson, I actually spend a lot of time showing you how to work with equivalent circular orbits. Okay, so what is an equivalent circular orbit? Well, going back in here, if I end up with an elliptical orbit, well, that's great. I have both an apogee and perigee altitude that I'm working with. Maybe an apogee altitude of 1,500 kilometers and a perigee of 200 kilometers. Here's what you haven't seen before. In QR3 for your rocket, your launch vehicle, its performance table tells you values based on an altitude. Well, which altitude do you use? You'll have to possibly find the equivalent circular orbit. And that's what that lesson will actually walk you through. You might not have to do that, but I can tell you that normally the launch vehicle performance tables are based entirely off of circular orbits, and therefore you're going to have to do a little bit more in order to project them onto an elliptical orbit or noticeably elliptical orbit. You can estimate things, but I wouldn't be surprised if the setup on this is the rockets are only able to carry a very small amount of extra weight, and so you're really going to want to make certain that you've got the correct weight. That's weird. Okay, I hit Shift F5. Anyway, team ownership. Okay, great. We were here. Equivalent circular orbits. I'm not going to go much further into that, but especially if you're feeling comfortable with the other things, you might brush up on the equivalent circular orbit. Or if you run into it during the competition period, you could watch the video, but remember that will take some time. That is one that has been very important to be able to get your max weight. Okay, QR2 skills that you want to brush up on. Clearly, spreadsheet basics. We've got a bunch of lessons both on my site and on Stellar Explorer's site that help you set up and work with spreadsheets. I do recommend those. They are really a must for the top level competitor teams. So if you've gotten this far just by using hand calculators, good luck to you. Very impressive. But semifinals and nationals are going to be so complex that you really need the additional abilities of a spreadsheet to help organize and do the things that you want. Countering that, do not overcomplicate your analysis. Do not try and automate everything. I've watched a lot of teams end up spending an hour trying to automate something that takes 3 minutes to actually do by hand. Well, if you don't have to do it that often, it's not worth automating it. So definitely do an analysis. Just because you can try and set something up in a spreadsheet does not mean you should. So try and think about the time cost benefit analysis on that. But the more proficient you are with spreadsheets, the more options you have. Power management for satellites. If they have something related to QR2 at all, which they probably will, my bet is you're probably going to have to do power management. There's no guarantee, but there is a decent possibility. Lighting time reports are very important, as we talked about before, and especially setting up for solar panels. One thing that I've noticed year after year, students have issues with trying to correctly identify how much solar panels they need in order to properly recharge their battery. If you do not recharge, if you do not supply enough power, it's usually a 50% penalty. Basically, if you don't have enough power for your satellites, you're not going to nationals is something that I would pretty confidently say, because it's going to cost you too many points. Mission lifespan, keep an eye out for that. And remember, in space, a year is 365.25 days because of leap year type stuff, that sort of thing. But keep track of that when you're doing your analysis. Key pieces of information that are scattered throughout the large packet. I mentioned this before. Keep an eye out for those, because sometimes when you're talking about an individual component, like in the section where they're talking about the cameras that you could add on to the satellite, maybe they have something that says none of the cameras can withstand above 5 Gs of force. Well, that would limit how many rockets you could use or what safety equipment you need to put in the rocket. But it may be listed in just one paragraph on one page, and so it's easy to overlook. Once again, the constraints board is really helpful for keeping track of these things, especially if you're using them correctly. Commentary from me, you're likely to need to do a budget of some kind. And what I say by budget, it means like data budgets or power budget, that sort of thing. And I've brought that up here. The data budget, I have several scenarios, at least as of the filming of this video, here in the QR2B series, that you can actually do some data budgets on them. And I have some video lessons that go along with that. That may be required, it might not, but it's definitely a complex skill and is something that would commonly show up, not every time, but commonly show up in semifinals and nationals. QR3, interpolation. I've made this extra big. I've made it all caps to emphasize this. Many teams may have been like, that wasn't that big of a deal. Well, sure, in QR3, you do need to interpolate, but you only need to do it once per launch vehicle, because you pretty much always are just told, okay, the orbit that you're going to is 600 kilometers altitude at an orbital inclination of 40 degrees. And that number doesn't change. But remember, in semifinals, you're probably going to be designing your orbit. So you go through, you interpolate, you find your correct weight, and then an hour later or 20 minutes later, your STK people say, oh, we found a much better orbit. This time we're going to go up to 1,500 kilometers altitude, and we're going up to an inclination of 72 degrees. Well, now you have to go back over and do that interpolation all over again. Every time you change your orbit, you're going to have to do the interpolation over again, and you're also going to have to do the interpolation over again for literally every launch vehicle that you're looking at. In other words, you're going to have to do that a lot. So, being comfortable reliably interpolating is something that is probably going to pay off at semifinals and nationals. So that's a place where you could try and build that skill if you're not feeling confident with it. Let's see. I mentioned before that most teams, it's been between about a third and a half of teams in semifinals end up with 0 points. I'm convinced that most of that is them putting way too much weight on the rocket. And I do want to emphasize this. Way too much weight is like a medium-sized dog. I like to compare things to pets, mainly because I have house cats. And so my chonky little babies are probably about 4 or 5 kilograms. That's enough that in semifinals or in nationals, that could remove 20 to 30 points off of your score. I suspect a lot of teams end up going probably 10 to 15 kilograms overweight and completely negate their entire score. Don't go overweight, or at least do everything that you can to avoid it. And I know some teams will go, okay, well, instead of actually doing the hard part of interpolating, I can look at it and the upper limit's 1,400 kilograms and the lower limit's 1,350, so I could call that 1,375. Well, I mean, sure, but if you're off by 5 or 6 kilograms and you put that much extra weight on, you could be losing 20 or 30 points. That's basically like not even doing the academic quiz. And again, you are very unlikely to be one of the top teams if you're making a mistake like that. So interpolation is one of the big skills that I can recommend. The equivalent circular orbit would also apply in here, because that way you'd be able to take your elliptical orbit and be able to work it to find exactly what your lift capabilities are. Let's see, secondary satellites are likely to show up in there, but not always. We've had some times where the mission has to happen so quickly that we're not even bothering trying to find companies that want to send satellites up. We're just launching right away. So I would expect that you're likely to have secondary satellites. Pardon me. If there's a QR3 focus, or even if there's a light QR3 focus, but if it's a QR1 and QR2 focus scenario, I wouldn't be surprised if they just don't have secondary satellites at all, although I'd expect that they probably have at least a few. Orbit changes by the launch vehicle, not by the satellite. Remember, there are several things that could change orbits. For the satellite to change orbit, you have to get enough hydrazine in it. For the launch vehicle to change orbits, you have to load up additional fuel, but they show up in kind of different places and they act different ways, so keep an eye out for that. If you can, you might brush up on some of that. QR3 is, at least of the filming of this video, something that I can't really take you over to my website. QR3 is kind of my least favorite one, and I have a few things that I have to figure out to try and make some scenarios on that. But hopefully in the future, I'll have more prep stuff for you. Though the nice thing is, in the build up to semifinals, you should still have access to the QR3 materials until right around the time semifinals begins, and then you have to delete them. So you can use those to try and practice other things. Okay. Carefully review the loads needed and the safeties, and be certain to add the correct ones. So this can actually be very useful. If you see that your satellite can't withstand more than 6 Gs as an axial load, and one of the 3 rockets has 6.5 Gs and no equipment to actually fix that, then that's great. You can eliminate one of the rockets. That's that educated guessing that we talked about before. You could eliminate that rocket and say, we're not even going to waste time analyzing it. We're not going to do the interpolations on it. We're not going to consider secondary satellites on it because it just won't work with our satellite. So that's a really good one to keep track of. I also saw with some of the teams over the years with QR3, I correctly identify that they need a safety piece of equipment, like they might need acoustic blankets. But then in that field, in the thing where they're putting in their answers to submit them, they select the wrong one. Like, they need the acoustic blankets, but they accidentally add a shock protection kit instead. They probably just selected the wrong thing on that list, which goes back to the thing that I mentioned before. You don't want to be panicked and in a hurry when you're putting those selections in, because unless you're really familiar with the things, for many of you all, it may be, I don't know the difference between a shock protection kit and acoustic blankets. Hopefully you'll learn that over time, but that further emphasizes being thorough and, once again, the everyone doing team ownership. If everyone's looking at that, someone's likely to catch, no, wait, we wanted the blankets, not the kit. We're putting in the wrong one. Switch that over. And then other people can go, are you sure? Oh, yeah, we did. It's a great way to catch problems before you submit them and they cost you. That's also one where it's thumbs up. If you end up selecting the wrong one and everybody thumbs up on it, you can't blame one person individually for it. I can't stress that enough. Team ownership. Okay, once again, constraints board is very useful for this. One final thing on QR3, weather delays might be possible. I have a thing on here that says brush up on risk analysis. The biggest thing that I would say is if you've got 2 rockets that you're looking at and they're pretty comparable and you like one of them a little bit more than the other, at the very least, you might take a look at, okay, what happens if we end up with like a 3 or 5 day weather delay where we get delayed by quite a bit. Sometimes some rockets cost a lot more with weather delays. And so if you've got 2 that are roughly tied and you've got one of them that costs like $1 million a day if you have weather delays and the other one only costs like $100,000 a day, you might get a rough idea of what that would do to your score. And maybe you go with the one that isn't as good outright, but can stand up to weather delays a lot better. This is what I mean by risk analysis. You could do a more in-depth one, but sometimes you can just kind of eyeball it and say, ooh, that one's super expensive if it gets delayed. Maybe we should go with the one that is cheaper if it gets delayed. Because delays are possible, but not guaranteed. Okay. I know I've been talking for quite a while. Thank you for staying with me, but all of this stuff, hopefully, I think is incredibly useful for both semifinals and nationals. So top competing teams, all of this information, either you're very familiar with it and therefore it was just redundant, or if you weren't, I think everything in here is very important information for you to be aware of and could be the difference between going the distance versus not. Okay, conclusion. Semifinals is a much better representation of what real-life engineering is. The likelihood of solving a real space mission design thing in 6 hours, that's not a thing that would actually happen, at least not for a well-designed mission. You could do a rough layout of it. But this is actually getting you set up to get a peek into what the professions would be doing these things. They're very tough, they're very stressful, but they're also incredibly rewarding. And that's what we hope that you get out of this program, as well as the skills and knowledge and fun. Once again, the scores are likely going to be a combination of several factors. How well you achieve the task and how well you do budget-wise. Balance those as best you can. One of the biggest things that I tell my teams, and I will tell you all as well, because I know this is a competition, there are points, it's a game and all of that. But for many of my students, they're looking to go into this sort of thing as a profession. And so one of the things that I say to them is your best bet is to always keep in mind what the actual objective of your mission is and prioritize that. So we had some scenarios where it was you could get some additional points by doing something secondary that wasn't the main task, but you were looking at something else. And then students would try and focus on that. And sometimes it worked out well, sometimes it didn't, especially now, at least as of the filming of this video. Stellar Explorer's briefings include stuff that says any solution that isn't focused on the actual objective may be subject to penalties or realignment. So that's one thing that I really want to emphasize. As much as this is a game and points are important, you as a possible future professional, you should always be able to step back and say, what's the actual goal of this mission? Let's try and get that done the best we can. And as long as you do that, whether you make nationals or not, that's the best thing and most impressive thing that you can do for any of us that are familiar with running this sort of thing. But make your choices among your team for what you all think is best. I'm going to reiterate what I tell my teams all the time, especially at this level. It is not enough to be good. You've also got to be lucky. I've had some incredibly capable teams that know orbital elements that can do all the budgeting and all of that, and they barely missed out on making nationals. And other teams that may not have known those things may have gotten lucky that they guessed on a number and they guessed well. So it's not enough to be good. You also have to be lucky. However, not to undermine it, the better you are, the less you have to rely on luck. So putting in that prep time, I can't guarantee will pay off, but it's one of the best things that you can end up doing because then you don't have to rely on luck near as much. I'm going to reiterate, a good solution on time and in spec is better than the best solution too late. That's the best advice that I can give to you, the advice that I've given to many of my teams, and we've had many of my teams actually make nationals before. Last thing that I'll say to everyone involved in the competition, good luck. Tenye wachesh gut. We'll see you later. Hopefully this was useful.